In May 2020, following outrage at the contents of the Labour leaks, Keir Starmer commissioned the barrister Martin Forde to conduct an inquiry into the party. A little over 2 years later, that report was released, and it was damning. Martin Forde outlined how factionalism had inhibited the handling of anti-Semitism complaints in Labour. He suggested that within the party there operated a hierarchy of racism, and he suggested that tackling racism towards black and brown people was too often seen as a low priority. It was a well-researched report, but it was pretty much ignored by the mainstream media and the Labour Party itself. And Martin Forde has now spoken to Al Jazeera about his disappointment.
Forde examined hostile WhatsApp messages between senior staff about Diane Abbott, a member of Parliament and an ally of former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn.
She literally makes me sick.
Abbott is truly repulsive.
There's no doubt that there were comments made within the WhatsApp group which were racist. I talk in terms of Diane Abbott and a visceral disgust.
Forde felt this reflected a broader problem in the party.
There were a number of submissions I received from party members suggesting that they did feel that the party had wider issues with their approach to racial discrimination. Quite a high proportion of black and Asian councillors or prospective MPs felt they'd been subjected to disciplinary action, which had been deliberately timed to exclude them from qualifying processes or selection.
In his report, published in July 2022, Forde made 165 recommendations. He was surprised to have heard almost nothing from the party since.
I've had very limited communication with the General Secretary, David Evans, but that was really housekeeping. I have spoken to a caucus of black Labour Party MPs in the House of Commons. Other than that, I've not spoken to anybody within the party machinery. My slight anxiety is in terms of the perception of a hierarchy and genuine underlying concerns about the wider racial issues, that it's not, in my view, a sufficient response to say that was then, this is now. These are serious debates that need to be had in a respectful context, and I just feel there's work to be done.
I was kind of stunned by that. You've asked someone, a very eminent person, to do this report. You've said, we want this to be serious. You know, Keir Starmer at the time saying, we don't want this to be a whitewash. It gets published. It says some awkward things for the faction that's now dominating the Labour Party, because it said some bad things about the right wing. You know, it didn't say that the left managed the Labour Party in this spectacular way, but it was very damning as well about the faction which is currently in charge of Labour. And Keir Starmer has just ignored it. You know, no contact. Said a few formalities from the General Secretary. One meeting with black MPs. You know, no one that wasn't, only the black MPs cared about this report, apparently. No one else thought that it was, you know, even worth reading or commenting on at all. Just been completely buried. I mean, Aaron, what do you make of that?
Well, this whole saga, and it's actually one of the takeaways from me with Labour after 2015, is that very few people in public life, and maybe this applies just beyond the UK, but I can certainly say about the UK, very few people in public life, and I mean politicians, I mean journalists, people that want to be politicians, who are often journalists, care about the truth, care about the facts. There was a bandwagon to arrive at a certain conclusion. Jeremy Corbyn's racist, the left is racist, the Labour membership is appalling, bad people, etc., etc. That was a freight train that continued for several years. Then there was a document which was released, was leaked. By the way, Martin Forde has explicitly said he thinks there's nothing wrong with that document, although it was, you know, poo-pooed by corporate media. We broke that story here at Novara Media about the Labour leaks, which is why we have the Forde report in the first place. The Forde report is then written in response to this leaked document, which reveals these appalling things. And if it wasn't for Novara Media, Michael, nobody else would have broken that story. Nobody. So they don't care about the truth. They don't care about the facts. They don't. They just don't. So for people watching this, our audience, who are under the illusion that people in public life care about the truth, open your eyes. They do not care about the truth. Clearly, everybody that cares about the truth cares about the facts. And by the way, this was clearly a huge mistake to appoint Martin Forde KC, because he does. Would say this, well, this is unacceptable. And actually, some of the assumptions and conclusions we arrived at from 2015 to 2019, maybe, well, actually, lots of that wasn't right. Maybe lots of that was wrong. But the media and the permanent political class made their decision on this story. And no no amount of information that will disprove it or discredit it will now change their minds. Utterly extraordinary. And I think for Martin Forde as well, you think you're a professional, you're a King's Counsel, and you give this hours and hours and hours and hours of your life, I don't know what he was paid. Was it the normal rates and so on? But there's an opportunity cost there for him, right? And it's gone nowhere. The Labour Party doesn't care. Media doesn't seem to care. And the National Executive Committee, the Labour NEC, was asking for updates on this report for months and months and months and months. Starmer supporters on the NEC, which by the way includes people like GMB, Unison, union people thinking they're on the soft left. Sorry, you can't see it. Why? Well, can't see it. Well, we know why they couldn't see it. It's because it gave us the facts. It gave us the truth, which is actually a lot of stuff in the leaked document was correct. Labour has huge problems, and a lot of that isn't just on the left. So yeah, lots of people in public life don't really care about the truth, don't care about honesty. That's why good journalism matters so much, Michael. And if nothing else, that's what Novara Media stands for.
So you mentioned there sort of like the media not covering this, and that came out in this interview as well, because as Forde explains, none of them wanted to speak to him.
Since July last year, how many media outlets have approached you?
I think I was approached by one on the day of publication, but they candidly accepted that they hadn't actually read the report. And I suggested they might want to do that first, and they didn't come back to me.
Is that it?
That's it, yep.
So no one was interested. I have to admit, Aaron, when I first saw that, I was like, oh, we covered this a lot, but I never actually thought to invite Martin Forde on, because I assumed he wouldn't. I thought after writing this report, he's not going to come talk to Novara Media, but it's probably worth a try, isn't it?
Absolutely, we're going to make an approach. He's spoken also to, I think, Middle East Eye. So he's clearly quite open to discussing the report. And why shouldn't he be? As I've said, he's given this a lot of time and thought and effort. And clearly the Labour Party aren't interested. Clearly the media's not interested. He probably wants to talk about some of the findings.
Some parts of the media were interested. One of the most damaging pieces of journalism during Corbyn's tenure was the Panorama episode, Is Labour Anti-Semitic? It made headlines for days. You probably remember it. It's a pretty appalling time to be on the left of the Labour Party. In his report, though, Forde referred to the programme as an example of misleading media coverage of Labour and anti-Semitism. Now, as I say, this did upset some people in the media, this conclusion. And in the Al Jazeera interview, Forde revealed how the journalists involved in that Panorama documentary responded.
The document I'm holding is an email from Karen Whiteman, who's the editor of Panorama. I would be grateful if you would consider amending your report in respect of your references to Panorama so that it more fairly reflects what the programme actually said. I also received emails from John Ware, who was the lead reporter for that documentary.
John Ware's email said,
Your report has done significant damage to my reputation and to that of the Corporation for Journalistic Integrity. May I ask you to respond by 4 p.m. tomorrow, 11th of October?
I was a little taken aback. The tone was rather like a letter before action that, I might see in litigation. I just came in with a completely open mind, which I'm sure Mr. Ware would say he did too, and he went where his evidence took him. And that's what journalists do. I felt I had a fuller picture because I interviewed not only some of the participants in the programme, but I also interviewed those who hadn't participated in the programme from the alternative faction, as they're often seen. And I would like to think that as I've been a barrister now, I think I'm in my 38th year, that I would have a degree of forensic skill and an ability to try and assess credibility and consistency, because that's what lawyers look for.
the main email used by Panorama featured in the Labour files. It was sent by the party's Director of Communications, Seamus Milne, to Labour's disciplinary unit. Panorama claimed it revealed interference by the leadership in the disciplinary process. Milne's deputy, James Snyder, described how the email referred to a specific case and had been heavily edited.
It reads, "This member is a Jewish activist, the son of a Holocaust survivor. If we're more than very occasionally using disciplinary action against Jewish members for anti-Semitism, something's going wrong, and we're muddling up political disputes with racism." Quite apart from this specific case, I think going forward, we need to review where and how we're drawing the line if we're going to have clear and defensible processes. So how this is used is just the red bit. So these 10 words.
I felt vindicated because you demonstrated graphically that it had been filleted. And I think the filleting meant the context was lost and a more sinister interpretation could be placed upon that email than was ever intended.
Forde refused to alter the wording of his report.
I couldn't go so far as to say that this was deliberate. It just seemed to me to be objectively entirely misleading to have that partial quote.
You can really see this guy as a KC, right? Because there are lots of people who, lots of activists, sort of small left Twitter accounts who ended up getting in trouble with John Ware because what they did was they sort of imputed motives. They sort of suggested this was John Ware trying to bring down the Labour Party or the Labour left, etc. And as Martin Forde there says, whatever your suspicions, we don't have proof of that. And, it's if someone is fairly litigious, you don't want to say things without having proper evidence. But what he's very confident he can say is that the outcome here was misleading. Whatever the motives, the outcome was misleading. He's a KC, he knows the law. And when he got that letter, which, many people would have interpreted as threatening. I know John Ware has said he didn't intend it in a threatening way, but many people would interpret that as threatening. He had the confidence in the law to say, no, I'm not changing the report, actually. In my view, it was entirely misleading, and that's going to stay there. Aaron, what do you make of that revelation? I think this is the first we'd heard of those emails from John Ware and the producer of Panorama.
Huge. Well, I mean, it's a subtext to the entire story. Of course, we talked about the sort of media treatment of the Corbyn years and how they're not really interested in the truth and the facts and so on. But the BBC Panorama documentary wasn't just about a certain faction of the Labour Party bashing another faction. It was a decisive political intervention by a quote-unquote public service broadcaster. And as Forde himself has said, he thinks he got to the facts in a better way than Panorama did. And I think that's indisputable. He spoke to a wider range of people. And I think they arrived at a more accurate conclusion because they were more forensic and they tried harder. Just a fact. I'm not imputing intention, just a fact. If you speak to more people, you're going to get better information, a more well-rounded story. Now, on the other hand, I suppose Panorama could say, well, this gentleman had several years to write his report. We had to make a documentary in a matter of weeks/months. It was months. Well, unless you can be fully confident about the truth of what you're publishing, particularly in the year of a general election, about somebody who may be the Prime Minister, unless you can be entirely confident, then you shouldn't publish it. So I'd be interested in hearing what John Ware has to say. Actually, I think, no, we have a better assessment of the facts than the Forde report. Maybe he thinks that. Interesting to hear his arguments as to why. And it's also important to say two things here, Michael. Novara Media, when we've run pieces talking about Panorama, talking about John Ware, we've had so many communications from him. I don't want to go into detail about them, but we have. And like you say, now, I'm not suggesting that he is motivated by intimidation. I'm not suggesting that in the slightest. What I am saying is certain people would perceive it potentially as intimidation because clearly for many people, it's not a normal thing to get involved in potentially, right? They don't know what libel law is. They don't know the difference between civil and criminal law. They don't know, the relevant legal steps, what they can do, etc. These people aren't professional journalists. They're not King's Counsel. They're just ordinary people, like say somebody on Twitter. And we stood our ground as well, and we published the piece.
I think John Ware would say, in relation to the saying Martin Forde spoke to more people, I think Panorama said we did ask to speak to the other faction, but they didn't want to speak to us, I think, because they were suspicious it would be a complete hit job and they didn't really want to sort of have their side giving the quotes because they didn't have any trust in sort of the process by which the documentary would be made. You can say that was a good decision or a bad decision, but I imagine that's what they say. Confusingly, I find it odd, John Ware, because at the end of this Al Jazeera interview with Martin Forde, they have sort of the statements from John Ware. And one of them, he says, so that email which was suggested there, which, Martin Forde clearly thinks is entirely misleading. And from that explanation from James Schneider, it seems entirely misleading. John Ware says, if you see the full email, full email, it's no one would doubt the interpretation I had. Now, I'm not sure if he's published this full email. It's very difficult for me to see from the parts of the email that we've seen how his presentation was not entirely misleading. And obviously Martin Forde agrees. And I think most people watching this, having seen what were the parts of the email that appeared in the Is Labour anti-Semitic documentary, and what was the rest of it? I mean, it seems to me pretty cut and dry that was misleading.